Have you ever thought of listening to God when you can't hear him? Maybe that's when God is actually speaking the most powerfully. Because it's in your act of faith and trust and not having clarity that you're learning to not lean on your understanding, and instead you're trusting with the heart. Hearing God's voice versus hearing your own thoughts. How do you know the difference? That's what we're going to talk about tonight. Hearing God's voice versus just merely being an echo chamber for your own thoughts reverberating in the chamber of your mind. How do you know what's God and what's just your own thoughts? Well, I think that when it comes to hearing the voice of God, where I've heard him the most powerfully is in prayer. Everyone say prayer. So what research shows is that when you talk intentionally to a God of love, the frontal lobe of your brain activates into its highest intellectual capacity, and you actually boost your brain intelligence not only by healthy laughing, but by healthy praying. Not only by laughing in a healthy way, but by praying in a healthy way. So laughter and prayer are both actually brain intelligence boosters. But what's fascinating to me is prayer is not just talking to God. Prayer is God talking to us. Psalm 42, this is great, ready for this? Says, deep calls unto deep at the noise of thy waterspouts. Isn't that great? Deep calls unto deep at the noise of thy waterfalls. Do you ever have a conversation with God and you don't know who's doing the talking? Because God's in you. And suddenly you're like, who's doing the talking and who's doing the listening? It's the goal of every mystic when the seer and the seen are one. Kind of like if you go to the orphanage in Mexico, who's doing the giving and who's doing the receiving? When you're helping orphans, are you doing the giving or the receiving? Are the orphans doing the giving or the receiving? The lines are blurred. Yes, you're learning the answer to a lot of this now. It's just yes. Basically every question I ask is yes. Which one is it? Yes. And so when the seer and the seen become one, it's like who's talking and who's listening? Let me explain it to you this way. So put on your thinking cap. Mother Teresa was interviewed by Dan Rather. And Dan Rather said, when you pray and talk to God, what do you say? She said, I don't say anything, I listen. Rather said, okay, well, when you pray and God talks to you, what does he say? Mother Teresa said, he doesn't say anything, he listens. Rather looked confused at this tautological response, and Mother Teresa replied, if you don't understand that, I can't explain it to you. And guys, I can't explain it to you through Western logic. We think so subliminally and subconsciously with Western lenses because we grow up in America that we forget there's other ways of knowing than your mind. There's instinct. Did you know that? You know there's other ways of knowing than Western mindset or intellect. There's instinct. And what happens is you don't know who's doing the talking and who's doing the listening. It's deep calls unto deep. Deep calls unto deep. Now, what's fascinating is there comes these moments in our lives where experiencing God's voice is a leap of faith, as Kierkegaard called it, a leap into the dark, a night of faith. It's that moment where you just learn to trust. Now, I know I'm going to get kind of mystical here when the seer and the seen become one, this union. There's that moment when trust is your way of listening to God. Sometimes what we're looking for is clarity, but God is looking for our trust. And he says, do not lean on your understanding, but trust in the Lord with all of your heart. And sometimes God speaks not through clarity, Western. Sometimes it's psycho-spiritual and transrational. He speaks through trusting, a leap into the dark. Have you ever thought of listening to God when you can't hear him? Maybe that's when God is actually speaking the most powerfully. Because it's in your act of faith and trust and not having clarity that you're learning to not lean on your understanding, and instead you're trusting with the heart. Isn't that what Jesus, that was such a great response. I wish everybody said that to my points. That was deep. I love that. Thank you. Please say that more often. Remember when Jesus set out the 72 by 2 and he said, don't take money and don't take an extra cloak. That sounds scary, doesn't it? But he's teaching them trust. Doesn't seem like a lot of clarity. What's he teaching? Trust. But there are other ways God speaks to us. If I want to know an artist, I love to get to know his art. One of my favorite authors is DFW, David Foster Wallace, and I think he's probably the most talented writer to ever live. And when I read David Foster Wallace, like his series of essays, A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, and his teachings on postmodernism and stuff, when I read him, I feel like I know him even though he's dead. A lot of my best friends are dead. Because if I look at the art, I know the artist. So what's another good way to hear from God? Let's keep going here. Another good way to hear from God is where? Creation. Creation testifies of a creator. And this is something tactile for our senses. It's sensible. It's something that we can latch and glom onto. When you look around at creation, do you ever see God or hear God's voice through the whisper of the willows? Do you ever hear God's voice? As Bob Dylan would say, the answer is blowing in the wind. Do you ever hear God's voice through the soft purring and vibration of your cat? I do. Fridge, man. He speaks as the oracles of God. But creation has a way of showing us what the Creator's like. You want to know what the Creator's saying? Sometimes you can hear him through creation. Again, in the book of Ephesians, Paul teaches how God speaks to us. He says he speaks to us through Sophia and phronesis in Greek. Sophia, that's where we get the word sophomore. A sophomore is somebody who's sophomoric, lacks wisdom. And so Sophia is actually, it means lofty wisdom. It's like when you're on your ivory tower gazing at the stars and reading Thomas Aquinas, okay? That's Sophia. It's like lofty intellectual wisdom. But phronesis, it's like down-to-earth sound judgment. You actually could say it's the difference between book smarts and street smarts. Now, I love books, but I have almost zero street smarts. I remember when I was with a pastor friend of mine who used to be in a gang. We were in LA and I wanted to go to like the gnarliest street where the gangs are. I'm like, I just want to walk through there, like not even to witness, just to go. I like to adventure. And he's like, you know, they do the walk of shame. If they see you, they're going to strip you naked and you're going to have to walk and they're going to post it on YouTube. I'm like, oh, that sounds gnarly, but let's do it anyway. And he's like, no, I'm not going to kill you, because he's the pastor having me for his speaking event. But anyways, I don't have a lot of phronesis or sound judgment, but what God does is, if you're willing to listen to him, he doesn't just give you Sophia lofty wisdom, but he actually helps you to make sound judgment calls day by day, where you're making just right decisions when the rubber meets the road. And one of the ways you do this is by reading where Sophia and phronesis are talked about by Paul. Read the book of Ephesians. Read the scriptures. Man, doesn't it reverberate with a thus saith the Lord? Sometimes God speaks to us not in the fire, not in the earthquake, but sometimes it's in a what? Still small voice. Sometimes there's this voice in your head and it gives you peace. You say, man, there's a fire around me, there's an earthquake beneath me, but there's a still small voice in me. And it's transrational, psychospiritual, not Western logical. It's God. It's God. Ben Courson here. Thank you so much for watching my new YouTube channel. Make sure to smash that like and subscribe button, share this video with all your friends, and hit that bell so you're notified every time a new video comes out. May the hope be with you.